Okay, I trust you can see this and hear me. Thank you, Phil. So you guys have heard some pretty good information already this morning. Really good tips on what to do when you become a victim or where to go to seek information. So some of that I will cover also in my presentation, maybe not to the extent that you've already seen, but we will hit on that. So again, my name is Mickey Ford. I work for the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services in the unemployment insurance area, which has been incredibly busy here over the last year. The teams that I work with include our employer tax compliance folks. So we have a group of auditors that will audit employer records to make sure they are reporting and paying taxes on the employees accurately. We also, another team that we have is our redetermination section, which is the first level of appeals for unemployment benefits. Those guys are crazy busy as well. But at the center stage right now is our benefit payment control folks, the group that handles unemployment benefit fraud. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation this morning. If I can advance the slide here. Whoops, went too far. So I thought so I could get a perspective of where we're at with unemployment fraud now, I need to go back a little bit to show you kind of where we were a little over a year ago. And we are affectionately calling this the good old days prior to the pandemic. So in a typical world, our fraud investigation team, the typical fraud that we saw was just this: claimants were collecting unemployment benefits. They returned to work and they failed to tell us that they've returned to work. That is a common theme. A lot of times we hear is, well, I didn't, I don't get my first paycheck until 4 weeks after I've been on the job, so I thought I could keep collecting. That is not accurate. Question number 7 says, did you work? Or were you full-time or part-time? Were you self-employed during this week? That is the key question. So even if you're waiting for your paycheck, we still want to know that you're working and basically not eligible for unemployment benefits. And we had real simple tools, National Directory of New Hire, which is required for employers when they hire a new employee, they need to report it to the National Directory of New Hire. That directory was originally designed to track down child support, folks that owe child support payments. So through court orders, and so to know when someone was working so they could catch up to those child support payments. We use it on the unemployment side for a different purpose, but very similar. We want to know when someone's working because at that point they become ineligible for unemployment compensation. We also have a quarterly wage record cross-match, which takes the quarterly wages that are reported from employers and we run them against the folks that have collected unemployment. And when an employer's been reporting someone worked 13 weeks and we see any number of weeks claimed in benefits, we start asking questions. If you're working here, how are you collecting here? We also got tips and leads from employers and the general public when these folks are working. So that's basically what our folks did. So in 2019, we had about 30 investigators, 6 detection staff, 4 management staff. So we were running Ohio's total unemployment fraud investigation, detection, and establishing overpayments with 40 people. In 2019, this is kind of a benchmark to where everything else goes. Our staff detected over 10,000 potential fraud cases. Not all of those 10,000 cases resulted in an overpayment or fraud, but we have to look at everything. And a simple figure here in 2019, our staff established $8.7 million in fraud overpayments. That used to seem like a lot, not so much anymore. So in March, this is when everything started to become unraveled. In March, federal legislators and the president first introduced the COVID Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, better known as the CARES Act. That pumped $504 billion into the economy through unemployment and other financial assistance funds. After that program expired and legislators were struggling to continue with the CARES Act, the FEMA got involved and put together a lost wage assistance, which worked very similar to the funding stream was very similar um, to the CARES Act. After that, late December, the Continuing Assistance Act, which continued the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, and then finally the last bit with the American Rescue Act. So almost $1 trillion pumped in through to the economy through just these 4 funding streams. So what did we have to do when all of these programs came? We certainly, our unemployment system that we had at the time was not ready to do any of the things that these federal funds were intended to. So one of the first things that we had to do is we had to create pandemic unemployment assistance, PUA program. So, and I'm going to show this in a minute, but what the difference is between a PUA application and a traditional UI application, I'll get to that. But I put this in here just so that you know that we had to put resources, and probably one of the biggest resources constraints that we have is our IT and OIS folks. We need those guys on everything. Anytime there's a change in our system, any kind of change in federal legislation, those guys are called upon to get this stuff changed in our system. So we needed to create the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. There was also FPUC. You guys may remember that as well. That's still going on, where at any given time we paid an additional $600 or $400 or $300 on top of your unemployment program. That needed to be programmed in our system as well. There were also federal programs that reduced charges to employers because of COVID. That had to be programmed in. We also had times of high state and national unemployment that triggered Ohio onto and off of what's considered high unemployment, which extends eligibility past the traditional 26 weeks. Those were the program and system issues that we have. Some of the other issues that we had were here, right here, first 8 weeks of COVID, mid-March to mid-May. We had more applications in those 3 months than the prior 3 years combined. So everything that we had in unemployment was at a strain. Our system was at a strain and our staff was at a strain. And of course, this last bullet is everybody needed these programs set up and to be paying as quickly as we could. I mean, it's one thing for the president to introduce funding for unemployment to help people. That's when the clock starts ticking. Claimants, United States Department of Labor, the governor's office, legislators, media, public urging us to get these programs up and running as quickly as possible. So a lot of stress on our systems. There was a lot of stress on our staff too. So one of the first things, the first hurdles that we had several hundred people working in the unemployment world that could not work in a central location. So we had to transition and provision hundreds of state UI staff to work from home. We hired hundreds of temporary workers from different staffing agencies. We recruited staff from different JFS offices and other state agencies. We hired hundreds, if not 1,000, intermittent staff. So the difference between a state intermittent staff and everybody else, state intermittent staff, they are hired and they work for our agency as opposed to working for another agency or working for an agency but being loaned to us. Also staffing and operations issues that we had. We were so busy during that first 6 weeks as we mandated every state staffer that was working in UI had to work overtime. I think we were working mandated 50 hours a week for those first 6 weeks. Every week since then, we've been offering and encouraging our staff to work overtime to either deal with customer calls, to deal with customer issues, to adjudicate claims, to investigate fraud. Whatever the purpose is, we have to have folks working and they continue to work overtime on a regular basis. Part of that was driven by our expanded hours of service during the week, weekends, and holidays. So here is a quick list of everything we had to consider for staffing. We had to work on how folks work from home with a computer. How do we get them phones? How do we get them, make sure they're on the right internet access? They have system access. How do they get to shared drives and folders that are commonly used by folks? What about data security, communications, meeting, training, quality, hiring and interviewing, productions, required reporting, backlogs, wait times? These were stuff that we had to deal with literally within the first several weeks that we had that the pandemic hit. So this was by the end of March, these were the things that we were having to consider. So I talked a little bit about the difference between the two programs. Traditional UI has an employee and employer relationship. An employer hires someone, they pay their wages. That employer also reports and pays UI taxes on that employee. And should that employee become separated from their employment and eligible to collect unemployment benefits, that employer catches a portion of the charges that are paid out. Applicants have a minimum qualifications to qualify for unemployment. Traditional UI currently calls for 20 or more weeks of covered employment. So that would mean an employer that is paying and reporting employees as covered employment, as opposed to independent contractors or self-employment and stuff like that, which we'll get to in a second. Applicants must have a minimum average weekly wage of $280. That's for this year. It changes every year. And applicants must have an allowable reason for separation. I put an asterisk next to that because that's going to come into the play on the fraud that we saw. So you have to be working for an employer. You have to lose your job due to an allowable reason for separation. You have to have 20 qualifying weeks, and you have to earn at least $280 a week to qualify and to receive benefits. On the other side of the fence is the pandemic unemployment assistance. That works completely different. So the program is set up for individuals that are self-employed, independent contractors, part-time workers, or another unable or unavailable to work due to COVID-related health issues. So a good example of that may be, I was laid off from my employer. They called me back to work, but my daycare is closed and I can't go. That takes you from a traditional UI piece and puts you into the pandemic unemployment assistance program to pay you benefits. Basically, the PUA system was set up to otherwise pay benefits to folks that don't qualify for traditional unemployment insurance. So two different programs. So the first wave of fraud that we started to see was through our pandemic unemployment system. And why? Because that was incredibly easy for folks to get into when we set this up. Again, when these programs were set up, everybody and their brother was clamoring to get these programs out and to pay. That was the number one item on everybody's list. Pay these benefits, get this money out to people. We got to pay, pay, pay. What came a distant second was some of the integrity methods that we have in place on traditional UI that we did not put and did not put at the time into PUA. So it was pretty simple. All you needed to do was give us your name, date of birth, and social security number. We would run that through the Social Security Administration. And if all those things hit, hey, we believed who you were. So that was step one to get through, and really almost the only step. The other times, the other requirement would be, so PUA was set up to pay anybody a minimum of $189. You could collect more than $189 if when you produced a tax return or otherwise established that you were making more than $189 a week, then we would take that information and we would pay you at a higher dollar amount. So pretty simple to get through the door. And again, that was by design. We're trying to get people paid as quickly as possible. So unlike traditional UI request information from employers, PUA at implementation required applicants just to provide that name, social security number, and date of birth. So if you've been on the planet anytime in the last 10 years, you know that there have been any number of data breaches and stolen identities that are floating around out there. Many of them are for sale on the dark web. That used to be where you would get personal information. Now you can just go to social media, and there are folks out there that, are not afraid to get caught. They want to get in these private chat rooms. They want to tell you how they've committed unemployment fraud, and they want to sell you their method of doing this or anything like that. But it became very easy for our PUA recipients to commit identity theft say that you were Mickey Ford with this social security number and this date of birth, and we were going to start paying you to the address or to the location or the bank of your choice. So what we had to do quickly, and I mean quickly, because we let a lot of dollars go out the door before we could close this door and sweep out the fraudsters. So what we're doing now is NASWA, which is the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. So it's not a federal agency, but it supports state unemployment program and works in partnership with the U.S. Department of Labor. They have created a data hub that can take information from states and runs it against what other states are providing. So if there are 30 states participating in the Integrity Data Hub and everybody's sending in social security numbers, we're going to know if that social security number, the IP address, the bank account, the email address, everything that we're sending through this data hub, we're screening to see if another state has tagged that data as suspicious. When we get it back and we see that it's marked as suspicious, we can take action on that claim to ask more questions from the applicant. And this happens before any payments go out. We're also running all of our claimant data through a database that looks for commonalities in email addresses, bank accounts, IP addresses. It makes sense sometimes to have 2 and even 3 people using the same email address if it's a family. Same with bank accounts and IP addresses. When it gets more than 3, we start getting suspicious. When it's 50, 60 people, we like to call that a clue, and we can take action with that stuff to try to get those claims locked down before payments go out. We're also taking action to prohibit known suspicious fraud data like email addresses, email domains, certain e-financial institutions that are nationally known to travel in fraud circles and work with those guys. The e-financial institutions are difficult. Loadable debit cards and stuff like that, it's not a brick and mortar bank that you're going in and saying, hi, I'm Mickey Ford, here's my driver's license, and they give you a debit card. You can buy these off of the shelf at convenience stores, load the data on, load money on it, use it to have money put on it. It's tough for law enforcement and certainly our agency to get back through the e-financial institutions to track down these guys. So some of those we have prohibited from applicants from using. Same thing with IP addresses. When we're getting flooded with the same IP address, we'll block that IP address so that folks can't get in the system that way. That's not stopping them, but we're slowing them down. We also have fraud scoring dashboard this is something that's fairly new over the last several months. We have a private vendor that now is taking the information being provided, is doing background checks, so to speak, to see, okay, this is the person that matches the social security number, date of birth, and name, but does it also match the email address and other types of things? And it'll create a fraud score for these individuals. And they put them in different buckets. One is a kind of a fast path, which, okay, everything seems to be fine. We're going to move you on to the next step. The next piece is, okay, there's some questions we have about this. We need you to provide us with some documentation to establish who you are. And lastly, if we are nearly certain you're not who you are, we're asking for a selfie to come in, like next to your driver's license or something like that, and we're taking that. So when we put these preventive measures in place, one of the first things that we saw was the number of PUA applications flagged as suspicious, they really spiked. I mean, I want to say nearly half of our applications coming in were getting flagged as suspicious. We also had any number of those applications failing some of the identity verification that we were looking at. Many of the applications, when they would get to certain identity verification questions, would be abandoned. So what we saw at first was high level of applications coming in, and as these fraud and detection and prevention measures began to hit, we saw the number of applications going down. And then after the spike of failing verifications hit, we saw the numbers go down even more. So we know that we're never going to be able to stop all the fraud as much as we try, but we do find that the more obstacles fraudsters have to go through, the more likely they'll have to move to another state. So every time we ask for another piece of information or something like that, there's a reluctance from the fraudsters. They want the fast path. They want to just do this theory or this process and get through to that. So that was the PUA piece. The UI, the fraud worked a little different, but our methods of detection and prevention are very similar. So to understand how the traditional UI fraud happened, I just want to explain how the application process works. So you punch in your social security number, name, date of birth, and then it's going to ask you, where did you last work for? And you're going to put in an employer because the state, we're trying to make sure that people aren't selecting the wrong employer. So one of the things we do is provide you a list of employers that are associated with the social security number. Yes, that was a quick path for folks to choose an employer, the fraudsters, but it was put in place originally so that we can make sure we're charging the right employers. So you file your application, you say you work for Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. We ask you why you aren't working there, and you say, well, because I got laid off due to lack of work. One of the things that happens when you tell us that is we send a notification to your employer and say, Mickey Ford said he was separated from you due to lack of work. And we give those employers 10 days to make a response. This last line is the big piece. Should the employer fail to respond, which wasn't the majority of the cases, the problem was, should state staff take no action? Ohio's UI system was originally set up to automatically adjudicate the issue. So in good times, when we believed everybody, you would say, I worked for ODJFS and I got laid off due to lack of work. Oftentimes, employers may not reply. So what we don't want to do is withhold payments from somebody that needs payment because their employer didn't respond. So in lack of work issues, we were paying those after 10 days. We have since stopped that, fortunately. But the problem we were having was employers were getting these requests for information and they were saying, you know, Mickey is working right here. He didn't file an application. This seems to be fraud. The problem was we were getting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents back in, and we just simply couldn't process them within the 10 days. And it was leading to this automation of releasing single payments out. So, and that's what this slide kind of goes into. During the first several months, we were simply overwhelmed by the application. We had everybody, I mean, I went through all the hiring that we did. And the first wave was try to answer all the calls that were coming in. Everybody that wanted to call us to ask questions or to file an application, excuse me. So employers were responding. They were telling us that this was fraud. We just couldn't get to it. After we got more current with the incoming application, the fraud scheme changed. So if a fraudster put in my social security number, it's going to say, this is Mickey Ford and he works at ODJFS. The fraudster says, I'm separated from ODJFS due to lack of work. So when we started getting caught up with this, we were getting employer responses that were saying, this guy's still working. He did not file an application. This seems to be fraud. When we caught on to that, we started taking action to lock down these claims as soon as we heard back from the employer, or if the employer reported it through a portal that we have, and I'll talk a minute about that. The fraudsters changed their schemes. So instead of saying, I'm Mickey Ford working at ODJFS, they say, I'm Mickey Ford working at Sue McConnell. And they would put in a fictitious address or a known address. But what they were trying to get to was they did not want ODJFS to respond and say that I was still working. So if they send something to any address that they want it, Sue McConnell's going to get something that says, hey, is Mickey Ford separated due to lack of work? And Sue's going to go, I don't even know what this is. And that was a way for the fraudsters to get around employers' interaction and kind of stopping what was going on. So what do? I hit on these steps, the integrity data hub we're using. We're doing multiple claimant, single data point screening. Again, with the fraud scoring and identity verification, talking about the selfies. We also created this identity theft reporting portal for individual employees, victims, and employers. And I'll give you a little bit more about that. The biggest thing we did was turn off the automation that released payments after 10 days. That was a big, big help. So if you're an employer, what do? If you, we insist or we recommend that you're reviewing all UI correspondence from ODJFS. A lot of times folks will get stuff in the mail and they're like, I don't have anybody collecting benefits. We've not laid off anybody. Whatever the case is, review that correspondence. And if it's related to an employee, check with that employee to see if they filed a UI application. Sometimes somebody can be working full-time for an employer and possibly have a part-time job on the weekends and then lose that part-time job and then go into filing a UI application. Just because someone's working for you and has a UI application does not necessarily mean it's fraud. When you ask them and they say, I never filed an application, that's pretty much going down the fraud path. What we want employers to do is go to our report identity theft portal, and there's the web address right there. And you just click on it. There's one for employees and there's one for employers, and they work very similar, but the one for employer asks for a little bit more information because we want to make sure we've tracked down the right employee that's being reported. So this information gets reported to the portal through automation. We take that information and through overnight batch, we are flagging those claims that are being reported to ask more questions of the applicant and to prohibit any kind of payments going out. So if you have something with one of your employees on it, they haven't filed for an application, you can report it through the portal. If an employer receives correspondence asking for information for somebody that is not an employee that works for your employer, it's difficult to report that through a portal because it's asking for location, start dates, and stuff like that, like they're a regular employee. What we're suggesting is you report that stuff to our identity theft hotline. And we provided the number right there. So you call in, one of our staff will pick up the phone. You say, hey, I received this correspondence, but this guy's never worked here. I don't know who this is. We've never heard of him. They'll take action at that point to flag that claim, to start asking questions from the applicant of what's going on. Employers, it's very important that you're reviewing your monthly charge statements. That lets you know who's being charged to your account. Make sure you're looking at that stuff on a regular basis. If you notice charges that are not related to one of your employees, report that information to the identity theft hotline as well. If you have an employee that receives ODJFS correspondence related to UI and they're telling you that they've never filed for unemployment, they don't know what this is, same thing applies. Have that person report that information to the report identity theft portal for employees, or to the ID theft hotline. That's the number provided. Also from this website, our unemploymenthelp.ohio.gov has many of the things that I saw on the previous presentations. Here's go to here. Here's how to put, credit checks, how you're pulling in different agencies to make sure that you're alerted if fraud is happening or if your social security number or your personal information is being used. So we have all that stuff on our website as well. If you're an employee and victims, very similar, review correspondence. If it's not you, you didn't solicit it, report it to our portal or on our ID theft hotline. And this is the example I gave with Sue McConnell. We'll see residents now are getting, well, not now, 3 months ago, we were getting reports from residents that got 20, 30, 40, 50 envelopes delivered to their mailbox, all with their name on it as the employer, but with 40 or 50 different claimants. So again, they're trying to use these fictitious employers because they know there probably won't get a reply from these folks that they work there because they're not an employer. So if you're getting that stuff, any of that stuff, we need to know about it. It may not be identity theft on yourself or even on the employer, but there's probably another victim out there that you can help make sure we get these benefits stopped. So I gave you some examples of where we were at in 2019. So our BPC staff now consists, so it went from 40 staff to 140 staff. So, and most of those folks are temporary staff that we brought on board that we're just trying to get through the workload that we have, trying to detect and prevent improper payments, pulling facts and evidence together, and establishing fraud payments when we can. So in 2020, we went from 10,000 cases to about 120,000 potential fraud cases that our staff had to review and or set issues on. And then lastly, in 2020, and this number is kind of low, believe it or not, $223 million in fraud overpayments. Because it's hard to explain this right, but when this says BPC established, that means that we've heard about the fraud, we investigated the fraud, and we adjudicated the fraud as overpaid. We still have thousands more issues in our system that need to be adjudicated. So this $223 million is going to go up significantly as we are able to process these overpayments. I do want to give you one last piece of the fraud that we're seeing, because I think we've done a pretty good job of kind of getting to the root of the identity theft that we're seeing. A new kind of fraud scheme that we're seeing has been hit on by the other presenters, and that's the phishing schemes. So the fraudsters will send out thousands of emails or text messages to a large population with the hopes that any number of the people that are getting these texts and emails have some activity in unemployment system. So there are spoofing our logos, our letterheads, fonts, anything and everything, and they're saying, hey, we can help you get your PUA payment. Click on here. And what happens is they click on it, and the fraudsters has set up a spoofed site that looks very similar to ours, and they want you to enter your login information and your password. They have now captured that information, and at some point in the near future, they're going to go into your claim and change the banking information to something that the fraudsters control, and they're going to get at least one payment before the applicant realizes, hey, I usually get my payment on Monday, where's it at? And then they call us and we're like, well, you changed your banking information. No, I didn't. And we find out that they were a piece of the phishing scheme. So that is something else that we're seeing kind of similarly. The only last piece that I did not include in my presentation is, after we write all of the fraud overpayments, we are working with federal, state, and local law enforcements to go after the fraudsters. Certainly the 30 investigators that we started with, and even now with 140 total staff, their background is not in cyber fraud like we're seeing now. So we need to work with U.S. Department of Labor, their Office of Inspector General. We're working with FBI, we're working with U.S. Secret Service, we're also working Homeland Security, state and local law enforcement to investigate and bring these criminals to justice. So that is the end of my presentation.